Welcome, my sisters and brothers, to this, the homily for the 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And we're back after the long pause of Lent and Easter to St. Mark's Gospel, to the continuous reading of St. Mark's Gospel. And we've only jumped very, very few passages since earlier in the year when we started with Mark. But in order to understand today's passage, which is a particularly subtle and interesting passage in many ways, I'd just like to remind you of one of the principles behind reading Mark's Gospel, which is what I call the double vision, the split vision principle, which is to remember that at the same time we are reading an account of Jesus' ministry, and we're reading an account of the disciples learning about Jesus' ministry after the resurrection. In other words, two things are always going on at the same time here. Remember that in Mark's Gospel, the young man in the tomb says, "Go back to Galilee." That's where you will meet Jesus, and that's how you will find out everything. In other words, the going through again, what happened the first time round, is what will show you what was really going on all the time. And in fact, as we'll see today, we are both before and after Pentecost in reading what's happened, what happens in today's Gospel. There's just a tiny little background, because Mark does everything so finely with just words and tiny differences with words, to fill you in what's gone on really in this chapter, in chapter 3. After healing the man with a withered hand in a synagogue, Jesus then goes to the seaside where there's a multitude of people. And the multitude of people is from Judea, from Jerusalem, Idumea, the Jordan, and beyond Tyre and Sidon. Huge crowds. These are from Jewish places and non-Jewish places. In other words, here already there is prefigured the post-Pentecostal movement away from the purely Jewish neighborhood. And we're going to see how that's going to become important in the passage we read. But what's really important here is in this account, Jesus has to get into a boat or prepare a boat in case he has to flee. The crowds are pressing upon him. There's the sense of considerable violence, of people desperate to get on him, to touch him, to be touched by him so as to be healed. And he throws out all manner of evil spirits, and they're thrown out crying, "You are the Son of the Most High, the Son of God." And so he rebukes them and tells them not to let him be known. But there's this huge heterogeneous crowd already prefiguring the post-Pentecostal world, and there is something tremendously violent about the way that they're pressing upon him. By contrast with that, what he does is he goes up to the hill. So we've had him preparing to cross the water, so it was pre-enacting the Red Sea. Then he goes up the hill, so pre-enacting the giving of the commandments. But here it says he calls to himself those whom he wanted, those whom he willed. And this verb, calling to himself, we'll see that's important, because we'll see both in today's Gospel, both a calling out, as it were, and a calling to himself. And the difference between the two is going to be important. And he calls to himself those whom he wanted. In other words, after all the chaos and crush of the people wanting a piece of him, as it were, now he calls those whom he wants, and he sends them out. These are the 12. This is where he begins to introduce order. The order that will enable his mission to go forth in a way that's not a constant and panicky crush, which can quickly turn dangerous. So he calls the 12, gives them their names, the ones written down a name, and gives them the authority to cast out demons and to begin their they begin their ministry. And so then there's the list of the 12. So it's after he's done that, after he's begun to introduce, if you like, the principle of some sort of order with the 12, it says, then we start today's gospel, and it simply says, then he went into the house. He went into the home. Okay, so please remember this is just him going into a home in Galilee. This is also after the apostles have received authority at Pentecost, their relation to the house where Jesus is, the new house, the new temple, the new place, which is an ordinary place, and their relationship with the crowd inside that, and how they are going to have to learn to interpret what is of God in the midst of that, they who have received the Holy Spirit. Okay, but so always remember the split screen reading of this. But here it's just, he's gone home. There's no mention at this point of the disciples or the apostles. And a crowd came to him again, so that they couldn't even eat bread. Okay, so just a fact, they weren't able to eat, but also suggesting that the whole thing was so crowded that even the Eucharist wasn't possible in the new house. And hearing those close to him, his relatives, about him, they came to seize him, because they had heard say that he was out of his mind. So his relatives hear a rumour that he's out of his mind, and they come to lay hands on him. And again, this is a key mark, or a mark word, because it can have two meanings. It's the same word that is used by Judas when it comes to betraying Jesus. The one upon whom I bestow a kiss, on that one lay your hands. In other words, that's the one who you should lay hold of. But that's, if you like, the violent word from outside. One coming from outside to lay hands on, to seize. But it's also the word on the inside, which is to lay hands, to take by the hand and raise up. In fact, when Jesus had cured Peter's mother-in-law, he raised her up. He took her by the hand and raised her up. He does the same with the little girl whom he raises from the dead, taking up of the hand. So the same word, depending on the circumstance, can be either a violent word from outside or a peaceful word from inside. Because they said to him that he's out of his mind. And the word existe can mean exactly that. He's out of his mind. He's crazy. It's actually the same word from which we get ecstasy. Both, as it were, the poetic reality and the pill. He's out of his mind. But please notice, again, this same verb is also the verb that's used of the crowd's reaction in the face of Jesus' signs. When Jesus performs the signs, it says, and they were outside themselves. They were astounded, amazed. So the same word, again, can have those two meanings, depending on whether it's an accusatory word or whether it's a receptive, positive word, the people who are admiring something. Remember the difference between the accusatory, violent word and the positive, admiring word. The question of interpreting which and what's going on here is at the centre of today's gospel. And the scribes from Jerusalem coming down. So they came down from Jerusalem to visit this area. And again, there's just a hint of the post-Pentecost. Those who were of Jesus' family, that's to say James and the group in Jerusalem, are coming down to try and inspect what's going on with these Gentiles who are being allowed into the church. But anyhow, the scribes come down from Jerusalem, and they said that he has Beelzebub. Beelzebub could mean Lord of the House or Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies was simply a corrupt slang way of saying the meaning was Lord of the House. So we're going to see the house is going to be important in this. What sort of house? What's it really like to be in the house? Who is the real Lord of the house? It says, he has Beelzebub, and by means of the principle of the prince of the demons, he is casting out demons. In other words, we interpret all that he is doing as the propagation of the work of evil. And then we have this gentle word. Remember that they're in the house. There's a crowd in the house that they can't eat. And then it says, Jesus proskelesamenos auton. He called them to him. This is the gentle word for call. He called them to him. He wanted to talk to the scribes. He wanted to explain things to them. He called to them and he spoke parables to them. And he said, how can Satan cast out Satan? And of course some people have said, well, it's quite simple. Satan is a big archie evil, and he has lots of little devils, and he can have any of his little devils cast out so as to give the impression that something's going on while he keeps control over everything. I don't think that's what is meant here. Jesus is making a rather more logical point. How can the principle of division be divided against himself? If you're the principle of division, of course, you multiply yourself by creating more and more and more and more divisions, but that's multiplying yourself, that's not being divided against yourself. If you're divided against yourself and you're the principle of division, actually, you do away with yourself. There's a genuine logical problem there. And if a kingdom is divided against itself, how can that kingdom stand? We'll see that there's probably a reference here to Egypt. Certainly in St. Luke's account of the same conversation, Egypt is referred to because, of course, naturally there was an argument between Aaron and Moses on the one hand, and Pharaoh and his magicians on the other, as to who had the power of God. And every time Moses told Aaron to do a sign, Aaron did a sign, like turn his rod into a snake or whatever, and Pharaoh's magicians went and did the same thing. And this got really stupid, because after a bit, Moses produced a plague of frogs, which then turned sick and died, and so the whole of Egypt was completely stunk out. And this was a ghastly health problem, as you can imagine. Imagine a whole country with major waterway, which had been turned to blood anyhow, and stinking, dying frogs all over the place. This is too terrible. If Pharaoh's magicians had been really worth their weight in salt, they would have found a new way to clean up Egypt. But no, they, imitating Moses, managed to produce yet another plague of frogs, which of course was a kingdom divided against itself. They were not doing Pharaoh or Egypt any favours. They were making things worse for Pharaoh and his favours. So that was a kingdom divided against itself. And it was an attempt to go against the power of God by mimicking the power of God in a way that did them harm.